B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Wednesday, February 6, 2019. Well, it was a torrent of lies, hyperbole, self-aggrandizement. We'll get to Trump's State of the Union message in a moment. But we lead our podcast today with more disturbing news from the Commonwealth of Virginia. And I still appear to be the only commentator in these United States, at least that I'm aware of, who has linked the assault on the top Democratic leaders of the state of Virginia with Republicans who were fighting back over proposed abortion legislation in the Virginia legislature and advocated by Governor Northam last week. Now, Northam is out of sight, making no comment. And his number two, the lieutenant governor, is facing serious charges of sexual assault. And the third in line for the governorship, should Northam and Fairfax step down, the Attorney General Mark Herring acknowledged today that he put on dark makeup, blackface, and wore a wig while he was an undergraduate at the University of Virginia in 1980. Now, we still don't know precisely if Governor Northam in his medical school yearbook photo is actually one of the two people in that picture, one in blackface, one in a Klan costume. But at one point he admitted he was in the picture, and then the next day he said, no, it wasn't me. And his handling of this has been ham-fisted at best. But I'm still focused on the political takedown here. And the goons at Big League Politics, who may have been egged on by Rush Limbaugh, who last Friday morning called for what I describe as a pro-life jihad on Governor Northam and Governor Cuomo of New York for advocating or advancing abortion rights legislation. Well, the guys at Big League Politics hit the trifecta. And they may have known about Northam. It's hard to imagine that they would have known about Fairfax and the allegation. The accuser has now come forward. We'll get to that in a moment. But the idea that the top two white guys in state government in Virginia, the governor and the attorney general, both dabbled in blackface experiences in the 1980s, it is bizarre. And it tells us about Virginia. And are these actions that occurred decades ago relevant? And do they require the expulsion of these men from office? So the accuser of the Lieutenant Governor Fairfax is a college professor from here in California. Her name is Vanessa Tyson, and she's got a doctorate in political science from University of Chicago, her bachelor degree in politics from Princeton University. She teaches politics at Scripps College, which is a women's college and part of the Claremont campus in Southern California in Orange County. And get this, in her biography, Tyson spent years working as an advocate for sexual violence awareness and prevention. And her statement comes in the context of Christine Blasey Ford's assertions that were made against Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh. And it falls into a very, very similar kind of zone. In a statement released by her lawyers today, Dr. Tyson said that she met Fairfax, Justin Fairfax, at the Democratic Convention in Boston in 2004. And on July 28, Fairfax suggested that she get some fresh air by joining him on a quick errand to retrieve documents from his room in a nearby hotel. They got to the hotel. She said, I had no reason to feel threatened. I stood in the entryway of the room, and after he located the documents, he walked over and kissed me. Although surprised by his advance, it was not unwelcome, and I kissed him back. He then took my hand, pulled me toward the bed. I was fully clothed in a pantsuit, had no intention of taking those clothes off or engaging in sexual activity. What began as consensual kissing quickly turned into a sexual assault. Fairfax put his hand behind my neck, forcefully pushed my head toward his crotch. Only then did I realize he had unbuckled his belt, unzipped his pants, and taken out his penis. He then forced his penis into my mouth. Utterly shocked and terrified, I tried to move my head away, but couldn't because his hand was holding down my neck, and he was much stronger than me. As I cried and gagged, Fairfax forced me to perform oral sex on him. I cannot believe, given my obvious distress, that Fairfax thought this forced sexual act was consensual. To be very clear, I did not want to engage in oral sex with Fairfax, and I never gave any form of consent. Quite the opposite. I consciously avoided Fairfax for the remainder of the convention, never spoke to him again. Then, because of the deep humiliation and shame, she didn't speak about it for years. But at the time, she did share it with a boyfriend who happened to be in France and with family members and others. So this is strikingly similar to Christine Blasey Ford. And it's a real challenge, given the circumstances. Will liberal Democrats apply the same standards? And how do you deal with issues, including the blackface of two of the top 3 elected officials, all Democrats? And if they all resign, the Republican Speaker of the House or Assembly becomes the governor. And once again, I need to underscore that this chain of events was triggered by a political hit calculated to bring down Governor Northam. And the landslide that is bringing other Democrats with him is just a bonus for these right-wing warriors. So Herring, the Attorney General, acknowledged, and he doesn't use the term blackface, he put on dark makeup and a wig while he was an undergraduate. This was in 1980. His apology? Because of our ignorance and glib attitudes and because we didn't have an appreciation for the experiences and perspectives of others, we dressed up and put on wigs and brown makeup. That I have contributed to the pain Virginians have felt this week is the greatest shame I've ever felt. He's deeply, deeply sorry, but he didn't indicate if he would resign. Now, what's also interesting is that Fairfax accuses Northam and Richmond Mayor LeVar Stoney as triggering the leaks of the woman's claim, Dr. Tyson's claims, against Fairfax. Now, I'd need a lot more information to know how they knew about her and how they could strategically release this at that moment. According to Dr. Tyson's statement, she came forward because she had heard the news that Northam might be forced to resign, and Fairfax would then become the governor of Virginia. So, in politics, it's easy to point fingers. And so we're going to have to await further coverage, perhaps investigation, to understand the full dimensions. But we've got a real political crisis for the Democrats and for the populace of Virginia. And boy, it just causes you to shake your heads. But please, do not rush to judgment. Don't be like Julian Castro and Kamala Harris, who waited only minutes after seeing the embarrassing and humiliating photos linked to Governor Northam that were popped on Friday. And as I said yesterday, I don't have any investment in Ralph Northam. People in Virginia tell me he's not that great a governor. But to see the Democrats enable the Republicans to take out the top 3 officials in that state, that is stunning. Another raid of the archives has further embarrassed presidential candidate and Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren. The Washington Post went to Texas, and they dug up her registration card when she filed to be admitted to practice law to join the Bar Association in the state of Texas. She filled out a form in her own hand, April 1986, and she listed American Indian in the blank for race. Now, she is, as you can expect, apologizing for this. She's sorry for furthering confusion on tribal sovereignty and tribal citizenship and harm that resulted. But she said, I can't go back. So these raise important questions. How do we deal with these issues? Where did Elizabeth Warren's registration card suddenly surface from? And is there some operation off stage where Democrats are routinely being subjected to these kinds of searches and investigations, looking for any way to embarrass them and take them down? It's hard to, watch this all occur and not imagine that it isn't accidental. All right, the State of the Union sucks. We all know that, mainly because Trump is the president and the Republicans control the Senate. Last night was an amazing exercise by a long-winded president who extended his own record for length of a State of the Union speech. And I managed to watch it all, but boy, was that painful. He spent more than 15 minutes dividing the country over his demand for a border wall and his demonization, using skewed figures and emotional calls about the role of immigrants in our country. And he began the speech calling for unity and bipartisan cooperation. Then it kind of turned into an American Legion rally. As Trump went through a kind of jingoistic honor roll, he identified heroes in the hall, veterans of World War II, Buzz Aldrin, who walked on the moon without, he moonwalked without blackface. There was there was shameless self-promotion, as he took credit for things that he doesn't deserve credit for. He lied about the unemployment rate. We'll get to some of that in a moment. And then he was pouring on what I call heavy corn syrup. Syrupy talk with a lot of corny, all-American comments designed to elicit applause from the Republicans. And I have to say that while I'm a sharp critic of Trump and his wooden performance before the teleprompter, with the exception of the way he turns his whole body from left to right as he reads the prompter, he delivered the best speech that I've seen since he became president. The content was awful, but his delivery was surprisingly better than we have seen. So when I hear Trump call for unity, what he really means is that the Democrats need to capitulate to his extreme political assessments, his hysterical description of caravans that are coming to our southern border again, his demand for a wall that divides the U.S. from Mexico and the population of the United States. And he was so hypocritical. He honored a police officer who was shot 7 times at the synagogue massacre in Pittsburgh, without, of course, mentioning that the guy who killed the people in Pittsburgh was a Trump supporter. He also exploited a recent murder in Reno of an elderly couple by a man who is described as an undocumented immigrant, but he's been in the country for quite some time. And Trump acts as if all these people just oozed over the open portions of our southern border. But the most astounding thing was when he used rhymes to try to get the Congress to stop investigating him. Trump said, "An economic miracle is taking place in the United States, and the only thing that can stop it are foolish wars, politics, or ridiculous partisan investigations." And then he went on to say, this is the rhyme, "If there's going to be peace and legislation, there cannot be war and investigation. It just doesn't work that way. We must be united at home to defeat our adversaries abroad." Now, as you know, I'm a skeptic of the Russia meddled in the election and chose Trump argument. But Trump is clearly guilty, in my view, of obstruction of justice. The Cohen plea deal makes that very clear. And there's plenty of other stuff to consider in investigations. And we'll get to it in a moment, but Nancy Pelosi, of course, rejects that as a form of intimidation and threat, but she never talks about impeachment, which is the constitutional remedy for our current situation. And so the speech where he attacked Democrats and claimed, as we talked about in Virginia, that the abortion legislation would allow infanticide, not true. And he attacked socialism after getting bipartisan support for his criticism of the Maduro government in Venezuela. He didn't actually call for interference or a military intervention, but everybody in the House knew what he was talking about. And as he demanded his wall, spending 15 minutes talking about immigration, he talked about drugs and fentanyl. He can't pronounce it right. But inconveniently, yesterday the Coast Guard announced that they have seized 35,000 pounds of cocaine from 21 separate vessels stopped in Pacific waters off Mexico and Central and South America. No wall will ever prevent maritime shipments, maritime smuggling. And of course, I'm lapsing into rational thinking here, which is inappropriate when you're talking about Trump. One of the best critiques of his speech comes from Carol Anderson, the African-American professor at Emory University. She said, well, he lied, but that's not unusual. He told of a strong economy without accurately describing the ticking time bomb he and Republicans set off with the $1.5 trillion tax cut. He misrepresented his tariff wars, supposed to be easy to win, but which have actually backfired and dried up $12 billion of soybean sales, forced Harley-Davidson and other companies to either close up shop or move some production out of the U.S., and fueled massive layoffs at GM plants in Ohio and Michigan. He bragged about low unemployment rates, but in fact, the figures have changed, and he ended up lying about the unemployment rates for African Americans and Latino, and claims that they are at an historic low. He insisted that his concern about illegal immigrants was to protect America's workers, while his businesses only recently fired a number of undocumented immigrants who've been on the company's payroll for years. Yeah. And of course, he never mentioned climate change, only bragged that we are now a net exporter of oil and gas, as if that's something to be proud of. And then Professor Anderson does a great job of explaining why Stacey Abrams' response, which was not a rebuttal, it really was a speech about different things, but I do think it was valuable, and I appreciated what she had to say. She talked specifically about racism. She talked specifically about how her election, she didn't call it stolen from her, but the voter suppression and the other schemes that were used to deny Democratic voters' participation is explained here by Professor Anderson. There was also a Spanish language rebuttal served up by California's Attorney General and former Congressman Javier Becerra, and we also got a Bernie Sanders rebuttal. And he actually did rebut specific comments made by the president. I'm linking to the full video, it's about half an hour, of Bernie's response. That's in the show file for today's podcast at peterbcollins.com, but here is a quick excerpt from Sanders.
President Trump said tonight, quote, "We are born free and we will stay free," end of quote. Well, I say to President Trump, people are not truly free when they can't afford to go to the doctor when they are sick. People are not truly free when they cannot afford to buy the prescription drugs they desperately need. People are not truly free when they are unable to retire with dignity. People are not truly free when they are exhausted because they are working longer and longer hours for lower wages. People are not truly free when they cannot afford a decent place in which to live.
Sanders did a great job, I thought. And what's interesting is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was interviewed on MSNBC's coverage, where I did catch Chris Matthews referring to presidential candidate and congressman from Texas, Julian Castro, as Raul Castro. But Ocasio-Cortez did get about 5 minutes on MSNBC, and she did a great job. She delivered some of the same message points as Bernie Sanders did, and I think she was quite effective in that visit to MSNBC. To the fact-checking now, and we can't fact-check it all because there were so many whoppers that Trump launched in his speech last night. Just a handful, okay? And this is citing from the fact-checkers at the Washington Post. Trump said, we've created 5.3 million new jobs and 600,000 new manufacturing jobs. They point out that Trump takes credit for things that occurred since Election Day, not since he was actually sworn in. But he gilds the lily, exaggerates things. Then he said nearly 5 million Americans have been lifted off food stamps, some brutally, I would add. About 3.6 million have actually stopped receiving food stamps since Trump took office. But this is the result of new restrictions placed by state governments on the recipients of SNAP. There actually isn't anything such as food stamps anymore, but maybe nobody's told Trump. Then his lies about the unemployment rate are interesting because he makes these claims that African American, Hispanic American, and Asian American unemployment have all reached their lowest levels ever recorded. Now, there's never been a serious issue with unemployment of Asian Americans that I'm aware of. But, for example, the African American unemployment statistic has been in existence for less than 50 years, and he claims it's the lowest rate in half a century, right? It reached 5.9% in May of 18, but rose to 6.8% in January of this year. Isn't that inconvenient? Then, when he tried to gin up emotional reaction about those dangerous caravans heading for our border, he falsely stated 1 in 3 women is sexually assaulted on the long journey north. And he cherry-picks the numbers, which came from not an honest poll, but just a kind of amateur survey. And only 12% of the people in the pool of those who were interviewed were female. So the statistic is derived from the experiences of only 56 women out of a pool of 500. And the real number is that 10% of the women said that they had sexual abuse, not defined as sexual assault, on their journey to the American border. So Pelosi today declared that she is not cowed by Trump's all-out threat, urging the Democrats to drop their investigations of his administration. Now, let's note that it was Republicans, including Rod Rosenstein, the guy who wrote the pretextual memo to fire James Comey, who decided to hire Bob Mueller as the special counsel. And the congressional investigations, both in the House and the Senate, have been largely ineffective. He's worried, though, about Adam Schiff taking over as head of the House Intelligence Committee. They held their first meeting after the Republicans failed to populate the committee on their side until this week. And he said that they've announced that Michael Cohen will not testify as scheduled before the committee. That's being delayed. May even happen after he goes to prison in early March. And that they had a unanimous vote in the Intelligence Committee to send all of the transcripts of previous interviews over to Bob Mueller, looking for more potential charges of lying to Congress. Also, Pelosi said that she would accept a bipartisan deal. This is a challenge to Trump. There's this conference committee meeting, 17 members of the House and Senate, both parties. They're trying to put together a package that would satisfy Trump. And so she is basically saying, look, I will accept whatever comes out of this committee. And she's challenging the president to do the same. That's an interesting gambit. Hope it doesn't backfire on the Democrats. Every day I pause for a moment to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Billy Cook just had his birthday on Super Bowl Sunday. Benny Alto kicks in multiple subscriptions, one for each of his dogs. Dick Atlee is out in Maine. And Cheryl Fleming is a longtime regular $5 a month contributor. I'm grateful to each and every one of you. and I use this to try to gently suggest that others can become subscribers as well. You want to do that? Visit peterbcollins.com, click on the menu tab, click on Become a Subscriber. You land on the sign-up page, and it's easy to sort it out from there. And should you like to avoid PayPal, and maybe you should, you can address your correspondence to me at Box 150, 660, San Rafael, California, 94915. Yesterday, I mentioned that BuzzFeed News dropped 2 mega stories related to Trump-Russia, and I had a chance to read them last night, and I will say that these are well-documented stories. They're not terrifically conclusive. The first is a detail with a timeline that shows how Michael Cohen and Felix Sater, who was an FBI informant and a guy who had been convicted of felonies, the two of them were scheming with a Russian developer to build this mega tower in Moscow to give the penthouse to Vladimir Putin, and they were very assiduously trying to court Putin for his approval. And the BuzzFeed story is interesting because they do have a lot of documents and mock-ups of the Moscow Tower. And this, of course, is in conflict with statements that were made by Trump and by Cohen. And we know Cohen lied to Congress, right? So the gist of this is that there is rich detail about the effort for a Trump Tower Moscow that continued almost until Election Day in 2016, despite the public statements that it had stopped well before that. And so, BuzzFeed, a team of reporters that includes Jason Leopold and his writing partner Anthony Cormier, they lay out a timeline. And the timeline is interesting because you see, as the sequence of events progress, the emails back and forth between Sater and Cohen, and they line up funding from a bank, and Cohen doesn't like the bank, and then they're trying to get a meeting with Putin. And, of course, when you look at this and you say, well, gosh, if Cohen had these high-level contacts in Moscow, and it doesn't appear he did, why would they need anybody else? Like Veselnitskaya and the others who came to the Trump Tower meeting in June of 2016. So there are real big-picture inconsistencies in the circumstantial evidence that is presented in this voluminous report. It runs 35 pages. And they also pair up these slavishly kiss-ass comments that Trump made during the campaign about Putin, and they try to connect them on the timeline to the actions of Sater and Cohen. But I don't find any there, or any there, here. And it is detailed and interesting and ultimately not terribly persuasive. The other story, which clocked in at only 19 pages, talks about Rinat Akhmetshin. He is a Russian who became a registered lobbyist in the United States. He was one of the many Russians who attended the Trump Tower meeting June of 2016. And what BuzzFeed lays out with documents that they got a hold of is that Akhmetshin received payments that they consider to be suspicious of about $500,000 in the period of a month before the meeting and a month or so afterward. And what I see here is simply that this guy Akhmetshin was a lobbyist. He was working for Russian oligarchs, and they were trying to unravel the American Magnitsky Act. And as I've shared with you before, the Magnitsky Act is based on a very problematic story brought by Bill Browder, originally an American citizen, a billionaire who now lives in Britain. And I don't trust Browder. There's a documentary that really opened my eyes to that. The documentarian believed the initial story about Magnitsky, about the, $230 million that was scammed out of the Russian government. And when you actually watch the documentary, you see that the filmmaker decided that Bill Browder was lying and couldn't even get an accurate description of Magnitsky. So once again, this is interesting. It does appear to be credible. The citation of Wells Fargo Bank and Bank of America reporting suspicious transactions, that appears to check out to me. But the bottom line is, this is embarrassing, but it doesn't prove anything about what went on at the June 16th meeting and whether this Russian lobbyist broke any laws or did anything that was really out of the ordinary, other than being Russian and getting wire transfer payments that drew the attention of bankers and regulators. Meanwhile, the nation of Venezuela, under still the authority of President Nicolas Maduro, they barricaded the bridge that connects Colombia to the southern border of Venezuela. There are 3 lanes there. 2 are blocked with shipping containers. The third with like an oil or milk tanker rig from an 18-wheeler. And this is to block the arrival of a caravan. They're calling it a convoy. But this is allegedly humanitarian aid that was called for by the rump government, the self-appointed leader Juan Guaido. And this is a Trojan horse. And I believe Maduro is responding correctly to this provocation. Because, well, here's the tip-off. Mike Pompeo suddenly becomes a humanitarian. He's our Secretary of State, by the way. The Venezuelan people desperately need humanitarian aid. The U.S. and other countries are trying to help, but Venezuela's military under Maduro is blocking aid with trucks and shipping tankers. The Maduro regime must let the aid reach the starving people. Now, why do I view this as a Trojan horse? Because the opposition clearly says that they have created a dilemma for Maduro that they relish. A quote from Juan Mejia, he is a current member of Guaido's party. Quote, "The government has a dilemma. Either they let it in, the humanitarian aid, or they refuse it. And in either case, they lose. So it is a win-win situation for us." That shows you what's really going on there. And in The Guardian today, the shadow foreign secretary in Britain, Emily Thornberry, so she's in the top ranks of the Labour Party, she made a carefully nuanced speech about various aspects of Britain's foreign policy. And she criticized the leadership of Maduro in Venezuela for calling himself a socialist but betraying socialist values. But she sided with a minority of EU countries, notably Italy, in rejecting Guaido's call to be recognized as the legitimate president of Venezuela. Thornberry said, "I don't think you make demands without knowing what you're going to do next. It's not about striking a pose, but doing things that are realistic and practical. Regional voices are very important, and I think we should be led by them more than we are, rather than unilaterally or almost unilaterally deciding this must happen by this time." That passes for dissent from this ugly power grab and forced regime change implemented by the oil-consuming nations who have their eyes on Venezuela's vast natural resources. By the way, speaking of oil and climate change and those sorts of things, I meant to mention earlier, I'm releasing part 1 of Dar Jamal's appearance here in Marin County last weekend. Part 1 is his talk about his new book, The End of Ice, and in his talk, he profiles or talks about 3 key locations where the glaciers are melting, where Miami is threatened by sea level rise, and where the Amazon is impacted by anthropocentric, I think that's the right term, climate change. So I'm releasing part 1 today, plan to release part 2 tomorrow. That's my question and answer period with Dar Jamal. And subscribers will find it at peterbcollins.com and our other outlets. Just on the heels of Trump's decision to exit the INF treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Missile Treaty with Russia, Putin has announced that Russia is ramping up the development of new hypersonic missiles that will travel at more than 5 times the speed of sound and, he says, will be invincible. But he's also telling his military to mind the budget. We must not and will not let ourselves be drawn into an expensive arms race, said Putin. And while I can't evaluate the threat posed by his hypersonic missiles, with a range of 5 to 5,500 kilometers, that's about 3,400 miles max, I do consider this to be a serious threat. And we should be engaging in new arms reduction or elimination talks, not walking away from previous treaties. And finally today, Li Feng at The Intercept reported on February 4th something that kind of fills in the blanks. You remember that over at Google, when they announced they were going to accept a contract from the Defense Department to work on Project Maven, artificial intelligence to enhance the ability of our drones to identify targets on the battlefield, well, the Googlers protested. They appear to be offended by the work that Google is doing for the war machine. Now we know that shortly after Google signed the contract with the Pentagon, they outsourced some of the really drudgery work, watching videos and identifying what was in them so that the artificial intelligence can learn for future application. Well, they outsourced the work to a company that has since changed its name from Crowdflower to Figure 8. And they use underpaid workers around the world, some in the United States, but also in Venezuela, Indonesia, and Russia for this grunt work. And they don't tell the people who are doing the work who the client is or exactly what the project is about. But I find this fascinating, that after a minor insurrection on the Google campus, they just went ahead and hired outsiders and went ahead and took the contract anyway. Google's motto is "Don't be evil." You think they're living up to it? I'm Peter B. Collins. Thanks for listening. You'll find this podcast on YouTube.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.